So today we are going to have an open session on a book that's recently being edited by colleagues from Chautari, Nepal in the long 1950s, edited by Pratyoush, Onta, Lokranjan, Parajuli, and Liechty. And we have Surya.
अर्को युज गर्नु अर्को
Mic is working, it's low.
Hello? Okay. So, the book is Nepal in the Long 1950s, edited by Pratyoush, Onta, Lokranjan, Parajuli, and Liechty. And we have among us a very distinguished panel to talk about the book. We have writer, author Manjushree Thapa, and we have analyst and columnist C.K. Lal amongst us. And we also have Dr. Pratyoush Onta from the editorial team. I'd like to introduce the two main speakers. Manjushree Thapa, author and translator. She's written extensively, both fiction, non-fiction, as well as she's done translations. Among the works of her fiction include The Tutor of History, Tilled Earth, Season of Flight, All of Us in Our Own Lives, and her non-fiction works include Mustang Bhot in Fragments, Forget Kathmandu, an Elegy for Democracy, A Boy from Siklis, and The Lives We Have Lost. And there are some of her translations: A Leaf in a Begging Ball by Ramesh Bikkal, The Country is Yours, and There is Carnival Today by Indra Bahadur Rai. Similarly, C.K. Lal, columnist for Kantipur and the Kathmandu Post. He is also the author of the books like Nepaliya Hona, Madesh Manthan, and Democracy, Governance and Human Rights in South Asia. I am Pranab Kharel. I thought I should not introduce myself. I work with Chautari, and the third person with us in the panel is Dr. Pratyoush Onta. He's a historian based at Chautari. Needs no introduction, I think, to the audience. Thank you. As per the proceedings, each speaker will have 20 minutes of their talk, and then we will take questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranabji. I keep telling, the given time is either too short or too long. Fellow panelists and the audience, it's very difficult to go about a book which talks about the long duration. The subject also is very varied. What I'll do is I'll just first begin in having a background in engineering. I like things to have a format. The format that I have taken is I was speculating why this book had to be collected in this form. What academics call the purpose of an academic book. From the first reading, usually they say when you have to talk about a book, you should read it 3 times. I have done it only 1.5 times. So 50%. 1.5 times in the sense many of these papers were published earlier where I had read it. This time all I had to do was scan it. Then there are some papers which are new, which I had to read again. So 1.5 times. From that, I think the purpose of this volume is, as it is written in the introduction itself, to challenge the political transition narrative. Political transition narratives of 1950s is mostly based on the interpretation that there was a Rana regime, it got overthrown, democracy had to be institutionalized, And this phase of transition, even though the transition was also pretty long, almost 8 to 9 years, so this transition narrative has put all its attention on political developments, political leaders, from there to transformation narrative. Transformation narrative, transition narrative is something like a child grows from 5 years to 10 years, changes happen. Transformation narrative is a fish becomes a frog, it completely changes. This kind of a transformation narrative is based on assumption that there are things happening which we see. Then there are things which we don't see at all, but they are still happening around. So this kind of a transformative narrative, it's an alternative way of looking at that period between I'll come to that, what is the period, but it seems to be a pretty long one. And then there is a third one, that the purpose of this book, that have things written about different topics in one place, very helpful for people like me. मेरो त के छ भने जत पठितम तत पुस्तकै समर्पितम, जे पढ्यो किताबलाई नै समर्पित गरेर, read whatever it is in the book and then forget all about it. This kind of book is useful that when you need to refer, it is in one place. So I thought that this could have been the purpose of this volume. Then the second is what they call, what is the thesis of a book. If there is no thesis, you can put anything together. But if there is a thesis, then it makes sense why such articles have to come together, why such papers have to come together. And there are a lot of theses, not just one thesis. You can look at the papers, then of course the underlying theme is what has been called from colonialism to modernization. Colonialism, especially the British colonialism, from which Nepali political struggle inherited, was a kind of anti-colonial struggle. An assumption of colonialism was civilizing mission, that these uncivilized people need to be civilized, ungovernable people have to be governed upon, people with no modern institutions, they have to be given institutions. This modernization theory was slightly different. Just as colonial theory came from the British, modernization theory came from Americans, especially from their Ivy League institutes and what used to be their propaganda institutions in the United States after the Second World War, especially when the locus of global power changed from London to Washington. So one is from colonialism to modernization. Second thesis is from what could be called the English method to Americanization. English method, despite being modern, was very hierarchical. American was based on individualism, on some kind of an equality, though not absolute equality. So that thesis also emerged from several of the papers in this. The third one, which I find most interesting, usually I wanted to term it Sanskritization, but M.N. Srinivas has explained Sanskritization is a completely different term. So I would call it Nepalization, seeds of Nepalization, which is especially in one paper, which Dr. Pratyoush Onta has written about Nepal Sanskritic Parishad. So not Sanskritization, but Nepalization, seeds of Nepali Pan, which in the paper emerges as Afno Pan from one of the characters. So these, and of course, globalization, seeds of globalization were already there. These are the theses that I gathered from different papers included in the book. Now let us come to the method. In the method, of course, first is the space, and for the purpose of this book, it seems that USA and Nepal are primary spaces, India and United Kingdom secondary spaces, and others simply fall outside the preview of the papers in this volume. So that we could say that is the space of this volume. Second is time frame, this long duration. It is very difficult to put specific time in any long duration thing. For example, the movement of a glacier. It is possible to put a beginning and perhaps an end when it melts. It's very difficult, the time frame of this. But for the purpose of analysis, one has to assume second end of Second World War could be end of Second World War, but it makes more sense to put it on the agreement between Nepal and United States of America in 1947 when Rana rule was still there. But Indian independence was already on the cards, in the process of happening. So that is the beginning of this long duration. The end could be, one could say that it was the Indo-China War in 1962, when American focus shifted from this frontier state in Nepal to a bigger frontier in the Indian theater. Or it could also be 1965 when second Indo-China War happened and more focus had to be there, China-centric thought rather than this Nepal-centric, the frontier state. Or what could just say that 1960 December when Royal Military Coup removed this, put an end to this transition period, political transition period, any of these. But in my opinion, it's better to consider it somewhere between 1947 to 1962, 15 years, a decade of 15 years, 1.5 decade, perhaps makes more sense. Or if you just want to put it a round figure, then it makes sense to call it from mid-1940s to early 1960s, then you don't have to specify the year. Then the third after space and time is observer, who is looking at the space, who is experiencing in that time. And this, all writers, of course, they are relying upon secondary sources, on archival material. So the observer is distant, it is not very close. And one advantage of distant, if you go close, you get a better view. Details appear very sharp. But if you look at from a little distance, then it's possible to have a three-dimension view. You can even look at the context, you can look at the background, you can look at on the ground, you can even have a look at the sky. So the observer looking at these issues are having a slightly detached view, and the presentation is in a narrative form. Then there are undercurrents, which comes from writers' insights. When you are researching something, you don't just learn what is there. You relate to your own experiences, your other readings, your interactions, then insights come to the focus. So these writers have given those insights. The content part is a little more difficult to talk in a 20-minute format, because each one of those papers requires some kind of a detailed analysis, which I think I would have easily skipped. But despite that, what I would say is, if you are reading this book and you are a lay reader, you don't want to go into too much detail, the introduction is quite comprehensive. It gives a gist of almost everything that is in the book. Individual papers, they offer details, they offer insights, but what they call conclusions of each chapters are very well covered in introduction. And in addition to those conclusions, the introduction also gives certain theoretical basis of analysis. It provides editors' own interpretations. So this is a very good one. Then the book is basically in two sections. One is more kind of what should I call it? How Nepal receives the world and how it reacts to it. And another one is most basically Nepal is just a receiver. Now I think I'll just have a look at the content page. I had a lot of flags, but I won't go into all that. The first time for no right. The first chapter is about Tilauri Maila Ko Pasal, a case of public tea shop in 1940s and 1950s. Pravas Gautam, a very interesting, very well written chapter, and also very well edited. I think I had read the shorter version of it in Kathmandu Post, perhaps. It seems to be a slightly longer version. It gives an overview how tea shops were not common. People had drank milk and something stronger at their home. Tea shops come into Kathmandu and it is turned into what the author interprets as development as a public space where hierarchies melt. I agree with this public space market instrument hypothesis. What I don't agree with fully is that it was public space. Perhaps it was a secular public space, because in Kathmandu Valley, there was no dearth of public spaces. Kirtan mandalis were public spaces, guthis were public spaces, temples were public spaces, music practice were public spaces, jatras were public spaces, but they all had certain limitations. It could be of a caste, it could be of a group, it could be of a community, it could be of a religion. What the tea shop brought was, it was a secular kind of a place where, of course, touchability and untouchability was still there, as untouchables were served in a different kind of utensils, or they were asked to wash it by themselves. So those limitations were there. But despite that, this emerged as some kind of a secular space, which was slightly different from the Ganga Plains, where the famous poem in Hindi by Harivansh Rai Bachchan, Pair Padhaye Mandir Masjid, what is that? Mel Karati Madhusala. So the wine shops were the places where this differences melted and a secular public place emerged. But in Kathmandu, the tradition has been that wine was made, alcohol was made at home and drunk in the family. So such a public drinking kind of a thing, that culture was not common. So perhaps this hypothesis is there. The second chapter, I have a 5-minute notice, so okay. The second chapter is most interesting for me, so I'll dwell upon it, and then the rest I'll leave for Manjushree to go into. It's about from development to Vikas, Nepal's transition to democracy and emergence of a concept. Very fascinating chapter, though written in an academic manner, how change happens in society. सबभन्दा पहिले the term that is used is briddhi, growth. So a child grows, a tree grows, that's a change, natural phenomena. Whatever has a beginning has an end, and between beginning and end, it keeps changing. I think that's comes from, I think, 2005 years old or something. So that is briddhi. From briddhi, then came the concept that briddhi is a kind of a circular kind of a thing. That beginning point is there, it ends and renews. So from the tree, there is, it grows, it flowers, there are seeds, seeds fall on the ground, another tree grows. Briddhi, even though it looks very linear, it's perhaps more of a circular thing because it also ends and begins at the same point. From there comes the concept of unnati. Unnati, I'm afraid, doesn't have an exact English term. Unnati is
progress.
No, that's pragati. Unnati is a kind of a vertical. It goes upwards on a pragati. Progress is, it has growth. It has change. It has velocity. It has change as well as direction. So progress is growth in desired direction, for which the term comes pragati. This concept of Vikas was very new. Vikas, development, emerged as an ideology, a project. Its assumption was after the Second World War and the beginning of Cold War, two simultaneous things happened. One was a Truman Doctrine given at the inaugural of President Truman, where he said that it's the responsibility of United States of America to contain and resist the spread of communism all over the world. Second was the Marshall Plan, same year, which was for Europe, and its assumption was that there is a capital shortfall. Capital shortfall is when you want to change something, fusion of capital is necessary, and that fusion can be from savings, that fusion can be from bilateral aid, that fusion can also be from loan, or that fusion could be from short-term borrowing. Marshall Plan's assumption was that that fusion has to be in a grant so that Europe can stand on its own feet, and then perhaps it can go into borrowing. And what happened is, budget comparison is not relevant, but this ideology of Vikas development emerged, whereby Europe got something like 2.5 billion, and for countering communism all over the world, 25 million. For Europe, one kind of ideology, capital shortfall, infusion of capital. For rest of the world, containment of communist. What do? You give an ideology that, okay, you can become better by going through the same route that we have done, which is education, health, infrastructure, and we cannot afford all the money. We'll give you seed money. What you need more is technical aid, and that technical aid, this ideology of development came with its own dogmas that this is how it goes. Its own priesthood, the economists, the managers, the project management theory. Arthur Lewis, the father of development economics, his ideas were presented in a short form, sold to the politician. My time is out, so I stop here. And if any issues come up, we can take it up during discussions. Your turn.
सुरुमा अलि अगाडि तान्दिनु सुरुमा अलि माथि पनि तान्दिनु
I hope I can be heard by everyone. So thank you for inviting me to on the panel. I was very glad to see you, sir, on the panel because I figured you would cover everything about politics and I could just talk about the writing. But I want to start by saying, you know, every now and then it happens that you read a book that you start pressing onto everyone. And I can tell you my long-suffering partner is here. Ever since I started reading the book, I've been quoting it in every single conversation I've had with all of my friends, all of my family. I was like, did you know this? Did you know that? And you know, some of them knew some of it and some of them didn't. So it's been one of those books that in the introduction, the editors mentioned that it took a long time to make, also because of the pandemic, also and other delays. So it took about 10 years to put together. But I feel like as someone who writes very, very slowly myself, delay was ramro was is a you know very very time-honored principle in Nepal. So it has come out, and it really is a book that I've been pressing on to absolutely everyone. So for me, the three things, you know, as it says, the introduction explains what the long 1950s, the concept behind why is it a long decade. This book is the anecdote to the kinds of texts I had to read as a school student here during the Naya Shiksha Niti, where all of Nepal's history and all of Nepal's issues were put in isolation, and there was no apparent relationship with anything that was happening globally. So this book really takes, it is a corrective to that. It takes on, as CK sir said, the post-World War II world where power shifted to the United States. You know, I always had a hazy sense of how active the United States was in Nepal. But this book does a lot to clarify exactly how interested they were in Nepal as the border between communist China and non-communist India. So the post-1940, the post-World War II order with the Marshall Plan, as you mentioned, and with the Truman Doctrine coming into play, we really see in multiple essays, we really see how those played out here and how they have shaped the public imagination of Nepal even till today. And then the third global going on at that time was the post-colonial movements around India most immediately, but all throughout the world, the post-colonial movements that Nepal was also very much part of in a way by overthrowing Rana rule. For me, it opened my eyes and made me see how not central Nepal was to global goings-on, but very much part of what, you know, global goings-on and the shift to the American power, sphere of power. So as a cultural worker, the essays that drew me in the most were the ones that dealt directly with the issues of the public imaginary, how that was formed, how public space was formed in this new order, in a new democratic order in Nepal, and in the search for a modern society, and independent from the Rana's society. So the essay that CK sir also talked about, Tilori Mailako Pasal, is the one that I've been going on to everyone about. I think in our generation, so I would say that we are the 1990s generation, so we came of age at that time. Even then, public space was small and it felt very small. but it's very humbling to see exactly how small it would have been in the earlier generation and how hard it would have been for the breakdown in limited ways, as you mentioned, because caste was still operational and gender segregation was still operational. So even with those strictures in place, it was humbling to see exactly how this public space started to create space for dissent and discussion and debate. So there's a really sweet story of Surendraraj Sharma narrates in that essay about how he had gone to the shop, to Tilorim Mailako Pasal tea shop, and seen BP there, and he was so intrigued that he followed BP as he left the shop, and eventually BP turned around and looked at him because he realized he was being followed, and asked if he knew who Surendraraj Sharma was. And the two of them then met and got to know each other, and which eventually led to the formation of the Nepal Thapa Sangh, a sort of politically affiliated student organization. So things like that we have no real sense of how small these spaces were. That essay gave me an absolute clear sense of that. I also really loved the essay that Pratyoush wrote about the Nepal Sanskritic Parishad, and reminded me very much of his own efforts in Martin Chautari to create a kind of public intellectual sphere where there can be a coming together of different intellectual personalities and concerns and interests to try and create some sense of a local dialogue, a sort of naturalized dialogue. There was also, I was just leafing through the book right now, looking for that one passage where I felt like Pratyoush's voice really came out in a personal way about the difficulty of editing magazines, academic magazines, and especially at that time, the Nepal Sanskritic Parishad, that was in 1951, when it was founded, that, just how difficult it was to get the kind of editing and the publication process, to have a printing press, and of course all of the distribution. So that to me felt very much like his voice suddenly took over the essay. And it felt very personal. The other essay that really, again, I'm talking about the ones that really affected me as a cultural worker, because I feel like these are the things that are still shaping our public imaginary. The Origins of Faith, about how Hugh Wood and the Oregon Mafia, as it was called by some, shaped the educational structure of Nepal. And this was, again, very much part of the US's interest in giving aid to Nepal, but on these technical bases. So he basically had free rein to set up Nepal's educational system from scratch, so to create one that, because before that there were only Indian textbooks in use and Indian curricula in use. So that to me was absolutely fascinating, about where he listened to his Nepali colleagues and where he didn't, and where he sort of promoted his own ideologies and went on with that, and basically got away with it, basically sort of was able to successfully set this foundation that everything subsequently has been in reaction to or built upon. So again, another very eye-opening essay. The essay on the founding of TU was similarly eye-opening, because it showed what the efforts of intellectuals and politicians and the royal family, how they all come together in a little bit of a hodgepodge way to create this institution that, and I was really intrigued to see the author talk about how indifferent Mahendra was to an educational institution dedicated to his own father. That there is this sort of difference in vision even in that regard about between father and son. Finally, there's an essay on Boris Misanovic, which, for all of us who grew up in Kathmandu, and I even saw Boris when I was young, so I'm that old. He has always been a bit of a mysterious figure. So it was really interesting to see how, one met the Nepali Congress activist in his club in Calcutta, and how he was very central to the royal family and their interests. He also got a lot of advantages from that, but also just again how he runs afoul of the royal family. It's such a small sort of financial interest that the family is after in the end, and so just through the arc of his biography, you get a sense of what Kathmandu was like in the 50s, but also in the 60s and 70s to his eventual death. So those are the ones, that explain to me a little bit why and I think a lot of us feel this, that the ghosts of 1950s are still haunting the present day. You get a sense of how the foundations were laid in the 1950s for teaching us how to think about Nepal, how to conceptualize the country, how to come up, with a Nepaliness, as CK said. What is Nepali bun? There's a sort of ferment and search for that. But that said, so not just the cultural aspects, but the other aspects that the book covers. So the essay that you mentioned about the concept of Vikas, the sort of ideology behind Vikas as opposed to Unnati or Pragati or other terms that were floating around in 1950. That is very revealing. The politics of land reform is an ongoing debate in Nepal about the many attempts at land reform and their limitations. A really interesting essay, I thought, that has echoes in the modern times around the 2015 earthquake was an essay about the 1954 flood and how the disaster response at that time and its failures basically led to the resurgence of the monarchy and conservative forces in the country. I think that's a very clear parallel that we see with 2015 when before that, which had been a moment of real opening and possibility in Nepal, and then the earthquake kind of shut that down and made it as conservative as could possibly be negotiated at that moment. So yeah, the thing that I found most exciting in the introduction was this concept that the editors talk about, not concept, the reality that Nepal has access to more and more information and archives now. So the archives of the University of Oregon, which previous researchers didn't have access to, or other archives, all of the writings of the ambassador in the 1950s, Chester Bowles. So all of that opens up information that makes historiography really exciting, I would imagine, that this is what historians live for. But also there were a lot of first-hand interviews that informed these essays, which I thought really valuable. Just interviews with people who lived through those times and knew the people involved or knew the activities involved, which also remains a very important source of information in Nepal. I wanted to end with two notes. One is that, again, being part of the post-1990 generation, I feel like 1990 itself was a huge moment of awakening for Nepal intellectually, where, the histories that had been suppressed, that couldn't be discussed openly, all of the political movements, the language rights movement, all of the identity movements, all of these suddenly were able to be aired out. So I felt like the country embarked on this massive project of learning about itself. And so this book, I feel, is very much part of that project and really kind of brushes away a lot of cobwebs. I thought that was, as you can tell, I'm mostly here to endorse the book than analyze it. But also I felt like it needs to be translated into Nepali because a lot of this knowledge, and I noticed this particularly with the essay on land reform, in which the author had access only to English language discourse on land reform so far. So I think that's a serious limitation, but I do think that there's a lot of new information, again, new archival information, new historical information. So I feel like if this book, the essays in this book, and I'm knowing Martin Chautari's record, I'm hoping and trusting that it will be translated. But I feel that if that is, if these essays are in dialogue with the work that scholars are doing in the Nepali language, I think that would be a really valuable contribution and make us all more intelligent. That is all I have to say. Thank you for editing the book, to all the editors and coming up with it.
Thank you to both the speakers. Now I'd like to ask the respective speakers if they have anything to add on to whatever the other speaker had to say.
This is interesting. I was expecting a little more from Manjushree about this tourism part. This Boris story reads almost like a novel, so well written. So, it's a. Then there are characters in the book which I thought a novelist would do more justice. We have a gentleman called Woods who defines what Nepal should be studying. Then we have this Boris Lisanovich, who thinks he is the father of modern tourism in Kathmandu. So these characters, they come out so well in this book. And I'm sure if she has not did too much here, probably she has noted it down at the back of her mind with possible changed characters in upcoming novels about Kathmandu.
I don't know about that, Siki sir, but one thing I did want to ask, I want to say one thing, which is, I forgot to say. It's an academic book, and it's very rigorously researched, but it's very accessible. So and this also speaks to the issue you were talking about, where, as with Woods, as with Mr. Boris Hasanovich, and many of the other characters, it really brings to life, Chester Bubbles again, brings to life what one individual in a certain time with certain historical political forces in play was able to do, and the ongoing effects of that till now. So it is very novelistic in a way. But my question to you was what you mentioned about how this book really places the US and Nepal as the primary actors, and India and UK as secondary. Now, would you say that there would need to be a companion volume dealing with India and the UK and their role?
This is extremely interesting point. We have, not in a book form, but lot is available on interactions with India in 1950s. Much less between India and UK. Surprisingly so, because we have a longer history of engagement with UK. So you look at the military part, it is there. But other effects of, upon each other in relationship, especially with the not Americanization part, but this modernization part, we do have something about United Mission to Nepal, which has other European actors in it. In the sideline, something come up, perhaps similar companion volumes and interactions with United Kingdom, and in a collected form, even with India, because we have scattered writing, for example, how Tribhuvan escaped to Delhi, or what went around at the negotiations in Delhi. We have it in B.P. Koirala's Atma Brittant. We have it in autobiography of Matrika Prasad Koirala. There are several other essays written about it, but not in this form. For example, Ramesh, formal name, Lokranjan, Dr. Lokranjan Parajuli. He has written about how these contestations went between Americans and Indians about who would have the final say in the setting up and operation of Tribhuvan University, and how they were negotiating with the power elite in Kathmandu. But perhaps similar things were happening in health services, for example. Of course, United Mission to Nepal was opening hospitals, but so, perhaps Indians were doing, especially through this Gurkha service centers. So these kind of interactions with India, perhaps in a little more detail than this, and even in this volume, for example, you know, uh, of course, in single volume, everything cannot go. It's impossible. It's a kind of an introduction kind of a thing, so that other researchers can explore other areas. There was something called Regional Transport Organization, a result of 1950s, which was a collaboration between USA, India, and Nepal, which worked in transportation field. That is how it impacted this modernization and Americanization, why bridges in Nepal had to be built to American standards rather than Indian standard or British standard. So such things, need companion volumes.
No doubt Pratyoush will be working on that soon. I also wanted to just add that one of the things that this book is full of is little stray asides and little snippets of information that, again, had me just talking to whoever was near me saying, did you know this? But one example, and this is in an essay I forgot to mention earlier, which is about the foreign interventions in the medical field in Nepal, that the early mission workers after the 1950s, not before, who came here also included the Flemings, who I don't know if anyone does bird watching here, but all of the early bird watching books in Nepal were put together by the Flemings, and I had absolutely no idea. So it just made me sort of jump up and go and get the books and sort of look them up again. And it's a book that has like a lot of details like that, even and is very descriptive. So the descriptions of the tea shops, the descriptions of how the magazines were put together, how meetings took place, how libraries were put together, how did intellectual space come to be, are really very affecting and personal. And I feel like we're still, I'm not going to make a political statement, but I feel like we are particularly right now in a phase after the 2000 constitution where the younger generation really just wanted to put aside the issues of rights and the sort of intellectual ferment and kind of let them rest for a while and just pursue wealth and well-being and lifestyles and comfort. And I feel like this book is a really valuable, again, corrective to that spirit. Say, it still takes struggle to create intellectual spaces. It still takes struggle to get people to talk to each other in a way that generates knowledge and spreads knowledge. So yeah, again, I'm just praising the book at this point.
I just wanted to add one thing. Since the book is about ideas, what I find missing is there used to be something called like Point 4 program or Marshall program or Truman Doctrine, something called Congress for Cultural Freedom, which, this Americanization project dealt with artists, writers, journalists, intellectuals, how to cultivate them for, anti-communist ideas dissemination. I think that's an idea which remains to be explored. A bit has been written about Congress for Cultural Freedom and their interactions with India. For example, Jayaprakash Narayan himself was associated with it, the chairperson of the Indian chapter. Then Hussain Ezekiel, the famous poet, Minu Masani, and sometimes I read their work and find exact similar phrases in Nepali. You read something called Certain Uncertainties of Congress for Cultural Freedom in India, and a Nepali writer writing Niyamit Akasmikta. You read something like a board game between USSR and USA, and I think Mohan Rake is a writer. And you find exactly something in the Nepali poet writing, Hami Goti Hon, we are the pawns, you know. So this is an area I think would be interesting because when we talk of ideas, ideas last for generations. Events disappear. Even projects lose their interest after a while, but ideas last generations. So how these ideas were impacted and continue to be, you know, regenerated again and again. Perhaps what Congress for Cultural Freedom did once, maybe Open Society Foundation is doing now, we don't know. So such things have to be studied to learn lessons and to understand. Not just learn lesson is, I think, too pompous, to understand.
Thank you to the panelists. I'd like to open the floor for questions, if you have, to both the speakers and the editor. Thank you.
पैसा
I wouldn't mind asking if there is any plan for translation.
I don't have any.
माइक माइक युज
Maybe before I answer that question, it would be useful to
भाइ नजिक तान्नु
to make another point, which is pretty early on in graduate school, I realized that if you were a historian of India and if you wanted to put together a book on any subject, you would have 15 people working on it in different parts of the world, and it could be done within a few years. So if this book has a particular collection and if it took a very long time to actually become a book, it's simply because that we have very few non-Nepali historians working on Nepal to begin with. Part of that is mitigated by the fact that we have anthropologists historically inclined who work on different eras of Nepali history. So it took us a long time to convince people that there was a book to be made on the long 1950s. So if the US scene is predominant here and UK is missing, it's not by intention. It's simply because people who we could bring together to be part of this book happen to be working on the .4 program or on stuff related to education, or Ramesh working on the founding of TU and it's part of the early Cold War stories between India and the US. So that kind of response to what you said. Regarding Manju's suggestion that this book should be translated, I agree, but it's not going to happen from me. I don't think it will happen as a whole book. I think it might be easier to think of the book as 10 translation projects. Some of these chapters are very long. So quite a few chapters are longer than 40 pages. Some chapters are longer than 50 pages. The book itself is almost 450 pages. So maybe to make each chapter a possible translation project, we'll have to approach it in that way. But I also feel like this book was put together to make a statement to many colleagues who are Nepalese by nationality, and to challenge them to think about the what we in Nepali call the Sat Salko transition, Bikram Samvat 2007, to simply suggest to them that the years that followed Satsal and the years that preceded Satsal could be thought of in other registers. And these are examples of in different sectors. Many things are missing here, obviously. So two projects. One would be for others to take up areas that are definitely not in this book, and proceed and run with research projects in those directions. Other would be
I had a question to editor. With the
Not editor actually, a contributor. The chapter that you have written about Nepal Sanskritik Parishad, I found that very fascinating. How did this idea of writing a history of an institution like that came to you? And apart from the material that you have mentioned, did you refer or interview anyone other than what the archive that you have mentioned?
my chapter was as obviously it's been published in this book for the first time in 2024. But I wrote my first draft of it in 2011.
अलिकति यता तान्नु।
नजिक माइक
माइक
It's
नजिक
taken a long time for me to actually publish it. In the past, I have published parts of things that I was writing because I was sure of that I had gotten it right. So in this particular instance, I kept thinking that there are institutional or personal archives that do exist in this town that I should have access to, and I shouldn't rush to publish anything. So that explains why it took a while to get it together. With respect to why this chapter, I think Manju kind of hinted at our early days of putting together Chautari. Manju is one of the founders of this organization. And our own struggles in the late 90s of trying to create an intellectual space that will be useful to all kinds of people, not academics alone. After having done this for too long, I obviously wanted to dig back and write about individuals who had tried this earlier, with some success and with lots of failures. And I was also taking issue with historians who have actually written shorter pieces on Nepali Sanskritism, and have sort of disparaged that group of people by saying, "Unarle ke kaam garera?" saying, what did they actually do? They published stuff that we had put together, so they didn't really have much to show. I think in the conclusion part of it, or at least the end discussion, I take an issue with them, saying that maybe some of the goals of this group of people that came together in 1951 to found this organization, they were very ambitious, and it almost sounds like their ambitions were kind of really out of scale, bombastic even. But I wouldn't question them, their ambitions. And they achieved some of their objectives for sure. We hear the word research ecology used all the time these days. And a research ecology requires all kinds of folks who are part of that ecology. And it's not the case that everybody does everything. There are certain people who do publishing, and they do publishing really well. There are other academics who do writing. I have worked with people who would not send 3 emails to an individual to derive. A lot of times I have to write 11 emails for people to actually even to agree to write a book review, and 5 more to actually derive the text. So, in other words, this is simply autobiographical in the sense that I am making the case that there are people who are no longer with us, who try to do things that we're trying to do today.
So I have a question. I've not read the book, but from what I gather, it's about how some people or some thoughts or some events in some foreign countries decided how our institutions were made. So I'd like to ask the question to the panel on where we can apply this idea from the 1950s, when many of our institutions were forced, and really relate it to the times today. Maybe there are a lot of institutions and a lot of events and ideas that are being formed today, and not just in this academic setting, but also in maybe geographs of person right outside of Martin Chautari? How can we apply that knowledge or those lessons from 1950s to today? That's it.
This is such a complex question. How can you apply institution building lessons of 1950s to 2024? Perhaps an institution analyst would be a more appropriate person. This is a what we call a consultancy assignment kind of a thing. But as a general reader of this book, one could say that maybe in the 1950s, the people who came to build our institutions had no idea of ground reality. Technical Advisory Group, TAG, that was formed in the United States to help these recipient countries of Point 4 program. The TAG people had no idea where they are going. What is the difference between Ethiopia, Nepal, Pakistan, Iran, completely different countries, but they designed institutions in a similar manner. So it was quite natural that it was difficult. When they came to Kathmandu, they found out that, they wanted to hire a house with not attached bathroom, but a bathroom, a restroom built inside the house. Usually, restroom will be an outhouse. And they suddenly found there were no houses available to rent of such a kind. So those, then they realized that, how do we teach sanitation to these people? Because they were accustomed to something else. Here it was something else. Now it is slightly different. The people who come, they are already aware. When they come here, they have read about it, they have seen maybe YouTube videos or listened to lectures. So they are also more aware. And then what is called the counterparts, the informants here, they are also easily available, conversant in the language. So that exchange of ideas in institution building works. That is one. Second is, you hinted at informal institutions. Informal institutions, by their nature, evolved from the ground, and if outside help comes, it just corrupts it. For example, initiatives such as Nepal Sanskritik Parishad in contemporary times is almost an impossibility. Cultural investment was considered a sign of accommodation in the new order. So Dr. Pratyoush Onta points out how Kesar Samser, got interested and was ready to finance some of the projects. Now, the moment you approached such an elite competent enough to finance certain intellectual work, they will give you an answer. Why don't you prepare a project for donor agency? I know such and such ambassador. Instead of giving you, they'll treat you to Rakshi costing 10,000 rupees, but will not give you 10,000 rupees to do your work, So this kind of environment has changed. So I don't know, I don't have a clear answer, but I think institution building, it was like about that joke that two salesmen going to the same place. One says, lot of opportunity, nobody has shoes. And another one says, no opportunity at all, nobody wears shoes. So maybe in the 1950s, we were in that kind of a situation. Now everybody has shoes. So we need better shoes, more fashionable shoes, more expensive shoes, I don't know. So different kind of a institutional design mechanism that we have to think about. Does that make sense, Manjushree?
My choice.
होइन चाहिँदैन म मेरो पालो भन्नु हस् मेरो नाम विष्णु सापकोटा सिके दाई in your opening remarks you said this book by way of introducing challenges the narrative of 1950s. I mean, the way it's been presented, it was interesting. I will explain later in different chapters about the few chapters you spoke about. So, and then I was curious. I'll come to my question with this little bit of not too long background, but when I think about history, like 1950s in my mind, it's all Gonzagal. Okay, we had democracy, and then it was a decade of Gonzagal and everything, and finally there was election. So there's the prototype of memory. If I think about like even like recent history, say 1990s, okay, movement opening and all that thing. So there's some kind of prototype of memory. In your case, by reading this book, after reading the essays in this book, what had changed in your prototype of memory of 1950s? Like before that, when you thought of 1950s, okay, I mean, when you talk about it, write about it, I mean, anybody, we think in a more structured way. But otherwise, when I'm just walking and all that thing, okay, 50s, this, 90s, this. Is there anything that had changed in your own narrative, in your own historical mental narrative of 1950s after this? And if so, what is that?
This is an interesting question. That is where I said this book is important. Whatever is written here, most of it circulated in informal settings. Nobody wrote about it. What we read was one thing, what we heard was another thing. What this book does is, what we used to hear is in a book form. And memory is usually what we read, maybe we can forget, but what we hear stays, you know. So this has kind of reinforced the memory of what we heard. And it, in a way, a vivid picture. What was, was that so? Now I can say, yes, it was so. So that kind of a change.
I think for me, it definitely, the narrative that we all had was, Nepal suddenly emerged out of this 100-year isolation. You see in very concrete terms what that looks like. So what does it look like when you suddenly have the US flooding in with all of these projects? What does it look like when a new education system is set up? And, the Hiloli Maila Kochiapasal, but also the Lokranjan Kochiapasal and Dili, all of these things are very concrete in this book. So it actually fills in a lot of gaps for me about my sense of the 1950s, where it was very abstract. As this says that, okay, Nepal opened up, but what does that look like? But I also wanted to talk a little bit to the earlier question about amnesia, which I think is a constant threat in Nepal. I feel like it's part of the natural flow of having such a young population, that people are constantly trying to forget the past, also just trying to move on, trying to move forward. And I think right now, unlike in 1990, there was again this kind of ferment, as there seems to have been in the 1950s, to come up with a Nepali democracy, to come up with the institutions to really build something new. I don't feel like there's that ferment after the 2015 constitution. It's a new order, but I don't feel like there's this real search for, okay, what is the Nepali response to the times? So I feel like this kind of book will counters the impulse towards having amnesia and just kind of follow the global, this globalized trend of having the market open up and that be the substitute for a better life. So I wanted to answer it that way. But I also have a question for Pratyoush, which is do you still think it is the case that, because I've always felt this in literature, that the Nepali language world is still in much more ferment than the English language intellectual life of Nepal, or is that not so much the case in your experience right now? So as to like how this book would play with a Nepali readership, for example, as opposed to with the English language readership.
That's a very interesting question. I kind of will have to think longer to be sure about what I'm saying. But I'm sure about one thing. At the current moment, we could not put together a book in Nepali or with original writings in Nepali to address the spectrum of issues that are addressed in this book. That's a statement about perhaps the narrow proclivities of historians of Nepal, who I've repeatedly pointed out, 99.9% of historians of Nepal are Nepali. 99% are trained in Nepal. And all of that sort of has led us into very narrow interests. It's partly inbreeding, but also partly our failure to expand the horizons of the discipline in very interesting ways, despite all kinds of efforts. So it's a community. The historians community do not believe in collective projects. I'm really happy that we are actually having this discussion about an edited volume. I put together many edited volumes in the past. And although we knew that, Ramesh, myself and Mark knew that we were putting together a good book, from the feedback we've received not only from Manjushree and Sikadai today, but from others who've actually already read it, this effort seems to have been worth it. I have talked to, obviously, many senior historians who point blank told me that there's no an edited volume in history is not worth the labor. I've been told this many times by senior historians in their 70s and 80s. There are many subtle messages in this book. I think Manju pointed to she feeling like I was writing a passage that was more autobiographical than the folks that were putting together Nepal Sanskritik Parishad. That might well be the case, but this is a challenge for others younger than us, historians of Nepal, to put together other collective volumes to basically take the terrain of history writing into more interesting ideas.
I'll just add one more sentence to Vishnuji's question. For example, like replacement or erasure of memory or reinforcement of memory. The chapter on politics of land reform in Nepal, 1951-1964, Peter Gill. I mean, it reinforces what we used to discuss back in the village, that Birta abolition was intended not to disadvantage the elite, but turn the Birta land into Reikar for their benefit. You know, this is very counterintuitive. We used to talk, but in textbooks we were taught that Birta abolition was a very progressive step of King Mahendra, whose draft was done earlier in Nepali Congress government. It was under discussion during Tank Prasad Acharya ministry. So Peter, kind of examines all that. Doesn't state in so many terms, but you can easily see that what we heard was not all wrong. So this is kind of a reinforcement of heard memory and replacement of read memory. So such things, for example, about Boris Lisanovich, this idea that he was one of the pioneers and celebrated, especially in English writing, a lot of we read about that. And then this is explored with all the gray shades that, the circumstances that brought him to Kathmandu, the way he got associated with various royal family members, how he was duped by many of them, how his business sense did not work. These were once again in Kathmandu Valley, one could hear this story in chatters till mid-1980s. But in written form, it was all celebration. Tiger Tops and then Royal Hotel. These were the pioneers of, tourism, modern tourism in Nepal. So, yes, this is helpful correction of memory.
Now I have a question to Pratyoush. Quick, you said the senior historians didn't think it was meaningful. Why did they think so?
I don't know. I mean, for literary writers like Pantu, obviously most of their productions are their own writings. I mean, Mantu has participated in, as you know, she's done lots of translations, and so you could think about her translation work as a collective work. She's also edited volumes. But Nepali academics don't have a proclivity for working together. And, I could go on about why I think that's the case. Several years ago, I mentioned in an interview that some of these egos don't actually fit in the Kathmandu Valley. So these are very big egos, people, so therefore it doesn't fit in the Kathmandu Valley, they can't work together. I was just saying that partly as a sort of a shorthand to a very complex situation where the enabling possibilities of working together, specifically in history discipline, it's a major problem. In sociology and anthropology, you find tens of volumes that have been put together in the last 30 years, which are collective volumes, collective outcomes of collective work. In history, if you could name me 5 or 10 even very good Nepali language edited volumes, I'd be really grateful, because they simply don't exist. I mean, in the sense that there are volumes put together with different people's writings put together as vivid writings, right? As miscellaneous writings. That's a separate category. But as a coherent, theme-driven work, collective work, they simply don't exist. And it's a major feeling of the history community, history writing academic community in our country.
So, may I?
Sure. Yeah.
So, just drawing from what from your last comment, one of the themes that I was thinking of as I was leafing through the content, and some of the things that you guys touched upon, and is one of the major themes that historians tend to sort of frame histories from the global south is globalization. And I thought it's interesting that, so I've not had a chance to look at the contents per se, but I thought that none of you panelists brought up that term at all. But it's interesting that you don't bring that term at all in your conversation. It's interesting because we are living in that moment in history where globalization is seen in certain as an opposition to indigeneity, to Nepalization, to localization, broadly speaking. But the globalization of 1950s that I guess your essay is sort of bringing to light is the globalization of discovering Nepali identity. So I thought if all of you could reflect on this conjunction of globalization with Nepalization in 1950s, that could be an interesting sort of frame for us to think with, probably in a second volume.
In this volume, I think you're absolutely right that we don't really pay any attention to globalization. As it became, as it came into use, especially anthropology, just as personal biographies, Mark and I both went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania. Mark's PhD supervisor is Arjuna Padurai. We saw firsthand the beginning of the journal Public Culture. Mark actually worked for the journal for some time when he was in graduate school. So we know that dance quite well, the early days at least. Marx's own first book, Suitably Modern, actually takes, you could say that it was written, the 94 dissertation Avatar and the 2003 book was written with anthropology being dominated by talks of globalization, that whole decade, right? For us, I think globalization is important here in the framing that we provide in this book, which is to say that none of us actually believe that the Nepal was isolated until 1951 story, right? So in our other writings, in the previous writings, we've done enough work to demolish that years ago. In this, we are making the claim, and here is the frame for the long 1950s, which is, without actually saying it at any, we don't say this, and we had a discussion about this among the three editors, that the whole point of long 1950s is not to actually delineate the years, because then it would actually defeat the purpose. So for different analytical purposes, and for different authors doing those analytical work, the long 50s actually could be sometime in the late 1930s to the early 60s. For me, it will be roughly, for the chapter I have written here, it's late 40s to 1964. For others, it can vary a lot. But in all of this, the sensibilities that come into effect in each of the chapters, or the characters we actually write about in each of the chapters, they are being informed by all kinds of things happening in all kinds of places. Whether you call that globalization or not is in some ways not very important for us to actually say they are, right? And as you know, global history is now all in rage, right? So everybody's talking about global this and that. Now with Sanjay Subramaniam, I happen to think that for every project that you take as a historian, you make decisions on the scale in which you want to tell your story. And I think each of our authors has done that. They brought all kinds of characters and written about them to suggest that if you want to now tell, if you really want to tell a good story about Nepal during the 1990s, then some of the archives that will enable you to tell that story are actually in Washington, D.C., not only in London and New Delhi, but in all kinds of universities, because you had characters from those universities showing up, like Wood, and several people in his team. So these are people who are not employees of the US state. These are employees, these are academics employees of universities who are showing up and doing their intellectual work in them. So part of the introduction that I wrote here on the archives is to simply suggest that these archives are now there. It's available. It wasn't available 35 years ago. Some of the material that's now available were not available 35 years ago. In addition, because of digitization, you do not actually necessarily have to travel to a specific archive to access some things. You still have to travel to access other things. So the possibilities of doing this kind of work is much greater today. Something that we don't actually discuss there, but I've now said this many times, which is with the expanding Nepali diaspora in all kinds of places, you would need to enable or get some second generation Nepali growing up in Virginia to be interested in visiting the National Archives of the US just 1 hour away in Maryland or in nearby. Similarly, second generation Nepalis growing up anywhere near London to easily pop into the British Library or the US, UK State Library just outside of London and do some great work on not only the characters about which we write here, but there are many other encounters. For instance, Christoph von Hammondorf contributed to be the first Western anthropologist who came to do proper field work in Nepal in 1953. All of his field notes are in the archives of SOAS in University of London. Somebody should go there and can just read them for months and come up with real gems. I've read a part of that, and even the one day I spent reading his stuff, it's quite interesting. So I'll stop there.
2 points. One, Nepali historians are not interested in collected volume is because, of course, egos. Second is the style of writing Nepali history. From my reading, it's almost all is the same. Periodization, Birudavali we call the great man theory of history, the events oriented. Seldom any insight is allowed in official history. So that discourages interlopers from going to their anthropologist or sociologist or those who have done some work. And that could be the reason. You have the same style of, you read one Nepali history book by one author and another. Differences are so little that, you have read one, you have read them all. Hardly anything new coming up. So that could be the one reason. Second reason is that these ideas of history from below, oral history, these things are new, we weren't there, and perhaps once in such collected volumes, they may come later. The third part about globalization is very difficult to define what is exactly is globalization. Is it globalization funded by IMF, World Bank and all that? A pilgrim going to Rameswaram and buying a pot built in Italy and bringing back to village in Nepal was globalization, some form of globalization. Introduction to consumerism, they were already there. Nepali soldiers fighting for Maharaja Ranjit Singh with the Afghans or with the British in Lahore was globalization. The Gurkhas fighting in Flanders, in Europe, in the First World War, in the Second World War, in Burma or somewhere in Europe was globalization. So globalization to Nepal, those who say that it came in the 1950 or 1990 are just kind of taking their understanding of globalization. And about this history from the South, that's I don't know, because that seems to be kind of a pet project of some intellectuals who follow the same pattern which they intend to oppose, using the weapons of the Lord to fight the Lord. That is worthwhile to watch, but I don't know how long it lasts.
Thank you, Sigedai, for that. And with this, I will have to close the session. I know there are some interesting talks around, so we can do that over the informal chat. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time. Thank you.